Have you spoken to Tim Davie yet, Mr. Lineker?
Standing his ground and being kept off air. Days on from Gary Lineker's suspension by the BBC, the ripples are getting bigger. The former footballer made social media comments comparing the government's rhetoric on asylum seekers to language used in 1930s Germany. Now sports coverage on the network's been hugely disrupted as commentators and analysts refuse to work in solidarity.
But here now is the best action from today's Premier League matches.
The flagship show Match of the Day was a short, some would say bizarre version with no commentary or presenters. And now opposition politicians are accusing the corporation of caving in to political pressure.
I think that Tory MPs have put intolerable pressure on the BBC because they don't like the criticism of their government policy. And whether you agree with what the language Gary Lineker used or not, he should be able to express his views.
Earlier in the week, government-supporting newspapers called for Lineker to go. But the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, says the decision was driven by concerns of impartiality, not political pressure. One complicating factor, the issue of the BBC's chairman, Richard Sharp. He's a major Conservative Party donor linked to the arranging of a loan for the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson as he was applying for the BBC job. He denies any conflict of interest.
What needs to happen as a result of not just the discussions about Gary Lineker, but also about the chairman of the BBC following the independent investigation that's now happening, is that we need to make sure we maintain that trust in the independence and the impartiality of the BBC.
As for the substance of Lineker's criticism, the government's admitted its asylum legislation could break international law. Some government critics here in the UK say this whole row is being used to distract from real discussion of asylum policy, but others say it's thrown up important questions about the people who run the BBC and their relations with the politicians.
Richard Sharp and Tim Davie appear too keen to do what the government wants. Now, they may say it's in the longer-term interest of the BBC, it's about the funding of the BBC, it's about the licence fee, it's about the future of the World Service. The trouble is there are moments when the BBC has to turn to the government and say, we're not doing it your way.
Gary Lineker's made it clear he won't be apologising. He insists he hasn't broken any guidelines. What's beyond dispute is that the BBC could have handled this differently, and it's now struggling to contain the crisis. Nadim, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, Aidan White is the founder and president of the Ethical Journalism Network, and he joins us live now from London. Good to have you on the programme, sir. I mean, there are blunders, bloopers and sort of general jaw-dropping gaffes that media organisations experience all the time. But how much of a mess has the BBC got itself into, as it seems to be mentioned across the media network in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think the BBC has got itself into a real mess. Of course, the BBC has a strong and admirable ethical base. It's at the heart of its international reputation as a fair and independent broadcaster. However, due to the events around the Gary Lineker tweet, it is today accused of double standards. The fact of the matter is, in recent years, many presenters and journalists at the BBC have robustly expressed themselves on social media while maintaining due impartiality when they're on the air. And that's exactly what Gary Lineker has done. But he has found himself singled out for treatment and discipline. So it's brought into focus and sharp focus the capacity of the BBC to maintain its standards, not just on impartiality, but elsewhere. But a big question mark exists over the question of enforceability and the need for consistency in the way that it enforces its ethical rules. And I think the BBC was going to have to find a way of doing two things. One is allowing its sports presentations to get back on track, and saving its reputation. It's a big task.
Is there not a third angle to what you've just said about sports programmes on board, get them running again, BBC's reputation? But the other thing is about the role of presenters. If you create, and I don't want to say Gary Lineker is a monster, but if you create the monster, then of course it's very hard to keep that whole ego or conversation corralled in. Presenters generally have a responsibility, do they not, to know the role that they fulfil within a broadcasting organisation. If Gary Lineker is a sports presenter, even if he does tweet what he is tweeting, does he not himself have a responsibility to realise what he's tweeting in the position that he has and in the voice that he has in the United Kingdom?
Oh, you know, I mean, I think Gary Lineker is very well aware of the potential influence he has. That's why, and he's been very clear over the years. This isn't the first time he's found himself in the crosshairs of controversy over this issue. He has made it very clear he checks very well. His communications are not abusive. He is always impartial on the air. He checks very carefully before he decides to publicize a tweet. And really, that's all that can be expected of people who are in the public eye. The fact of the matter is the BBC has been trying to control and manage big beasts in broadcasting for decades. In recent times, we've seen people like Alan Sugar, people who have really been able to influence and have a big audience who've been able to express themselves freely. But the question is, why is it that Lineker has suddenly been singled out? And that's why the BBC's got itself into an additional mess, which is the suggestion that there's been some political pressure applied. In the end, the BBC is going to have to re-examine, as Tim Davie has said, it's a policy regarding due impartiality, and it's going to have to look at the question of enforceability and also consistency. If it begins to do that and it opens up a debate involving asking its own presenters, its own journalists, what they think about this, how it can be developed, even asking outside contributors like Lineker and others to take part in that review, I think they'll find a way to solve the problem.
And just very briefly, Mr. White, 'cause we're running out of time, I was just wondering, is it a case, as you say, that the BBC has to take a step back and have sort of like an independent commission to work out how to move forward in a scenario like this, when social media and the internet is so prevalent and that one word can be, you know, broadcast all over the world and interpreted in so many different ways? Who would be on those sorts of independent panels or review bodies?
I mean, I think there are a fantastic amount of sort of good experts who can be brought in to sort of assist and advise. There's no doubt at all about it. But remember, what we're talking about here is a tweet, for goodness sake. And, you know, whether it was ill-judged or not, the fact of the matter is it is getting in the way of a proper debate about an important shift in government policy. I think the BBC has to take itself out of the headlines, have a proper review, and I think it can find the right people to help it carry out that review and to get things back on track as soon as possible. It can do this, and I think Tim Davie has already indicated that that's the path he's going to take. I think if he does that, it'll be the right thing.
We'll see what happens. For the moment, Aidan White, so good to speak to you. Thanks for joining us from London.
Thank you very much.